Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Rodney Hill. I'm an associate professor in radio, television, film in the Herbert School of Communication at Hofstra. And I'll be speaking with you today about two of my favorite subjects, the Coen brothers and Stanley Kubrick. First of all, I want to thank Melissa Connolly of University Relations and also everybody at Hofstra's Cultural Center, especially Carol Mallison, who's here with us, for the wonderful programming that they've continued to provide for the community throughout this difficult time. So thank you, Carol. So as I was saying before we really formally began, for quite a long time, I've been thinking about Joel and Ethan Coen's affinity for the films of Stanley Kubrick. And I recently had a chance to explore those ideas more fully in an essay for the new book called After Kubrick, A Filmmaker's Legacy. So I have a chapter in that book on the Coen brothers and Stanley Kubrick. It's a wonderful collection of essays by a lot of different film scholars. So I'll be sharing some of those observations with you today, starting with some fairly direct, sometimes indirect references to Kubrick that we find in the Coen brothers films. Then we'll look at briefly at some surface level similarities between their work and their careers, finally moving to some deeper connections in terms of aesthetics and philosophy. The Coens, for me, the first clear reference that the Coen brothers make to Stanley Kubrick comes in their 1987 hayseed comedy, Raising Arizona. And it's a reference to Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, Kubrick's film from 1964. You may recall that in the film, there's a squadron of bombers on the way to Russian targets, and Peter Sellers' character, Captain Mandrake, is trying to solve the problem of the recall code to get those bombers recalled. And he finds the solution in these sort of insane scribblings of the general, played by Sterling Hayden. And the Sellers character is sort of musing on what this might be. And he said, peace on earth, purity of essence, EOP-OPE, POE-OPE. So he specifically is articulating this thought process as he's trying to solve that riddle. In Raising Arizona, early in the film, this lone biker character that we were talking about beforehand, played by Randall Tex Cobb, is trying to track down two escaped convicts who are connected with the kidnapping of the baby Nathan Arizona Jr. And the biker picks up their trail at this gas station men's room. Now, this POE-OPE may be seen to be just a throwaway reference to Dr. Strangelove in the manner of the so-called empty pastiche that is often attributed to the Coens. But I think that characterization is erroneous, as I will argue later on. But in any case, this brief reference establishes the biker as an apocalyptic character. We recall the apocalyptic ending of Dr. Strangelove, as well as alluding to a puzzle to be solved, in this case, the prison escape as well as the kidnapping. It's a different kind of puzzle than in Dr. Strangelove. But further, it represents a nod from one dark comedy to another. A more extended example comes much later in the Coen brothers' career, as they offer, I think, another unmistakable reference to Kubrick in the opening sequence of No Country for Old Men. As Sheriff Ed Tom Bell, Tommy Lee Jones, narrates the opening of No Country, we see a series of 12 arid landscapes taking us from dawn to mid-morning, obliquely echoing the series of prehistoric sunrises at the opening of 2001 in the Dawn of Man sequence. A couple of these images, including the one you see here, I think provide particularly striking visual rhymes with Kubrick's film. And again, more than just a superficial moment of postmodernism, I think this subtle reference to 2001 suggests that No Country for Old Men also will present a narrative that is to be taken on an epic, mythological, even metaphysical level. And furthermore, in both films, these landscapes provide the settings for the most primal of conflicts. More substantially, In Barton Fink, we find quite a bit of resonance with The Shining. The sickly green bathtub in Barton's hotel room, a striking anachronism given the film's 1930s setting, indirectly calls to mind the modern haunted green bathroom in The Shining. Of course, Barton's bathroom is multivalent, as is usually the case with the Coen brothers' intertextual references. It alternately calls to mind Hitchcock's Psycho, Coppola's The Conversation, and David Lynch. But Barton Fink's kinship with Kubrick and The Shining goes deeper. It presents the story of a frustrated writer holed up in a creepy hotel with supernatural undertones and an uncanny visual aesthetic, as with the gooey, peeling wallpaper, the floating, disembodied camera wandering through the eerily symmetrical hallways. And furthermore, just as Lloyd the bartender and Delbert Grady in The Shining may be read as external manifestations of Jack's troubled psyche, Charlie, John Goodman, seems to emerge out of Barton's unconscious. Such a bold, unconventional narrative tactic is not unknown to the Coens, who offer a similar monster from the id with the lone biker in Raising Arizona. We might also note that Barton's overly familiar homoerotic relationship with Charlie, remember this scene, and later on Barton says to the police, "We're men, we wrestled." This also calls to mind the uncomfortable kinship between Humbert, James Mason, and his doppelganger Claire Quilty in Lolita. Other often brief examples abound, such as the bathtub scene between Billy Bob Thornton's barber character and his wife, Frances McDormand, in The Man Who Wasn't There. As he tenderly takes her leg in his hand, lathers it with soap, and begins to shave, one is reminded of the iconic toenail painting shot that opens Lolita. In O Brother, Where Art Thou?, the scene in which our three protagonists infiltrate a Klan rally offers a parodic riff not only on The Wizard of Oz, but also on Bill Harford's horrific encounter with Red Cloak and Harford's ultimate unmasking in Eyes Wide Shut. And more significantly, O Brother, Where Art Thou? Is among the most overtly mythical films in the Coens' body of work, as a loose adaptation of Homer's Odyssey, adapted even more loosely by Kubrick with 2001. Having noted these sometimes fleeting references, we may begin to see other similarities between the careers of Joel and Ethan Coen and Stanley Kubrick, such as the disparate nature of their work from one film to the next, the high degree of independence that they have been able to maintain, and their reliance on established film genres. Another key point of comparison is that, like Kubrick's films, those of the Coen brothers cry out for interpretation. Even the seemingly light, cartoonish comedy Raising Arizona leaves us with an ambiguous ending worthy of Kubrick, as the character of High, Nicolas Cage, awakens from the film's final dream, intoning in voiceover, "I don't know, maybe it was Utah." Indeed, dreams and dreamlike imagery pepper the entire film, and the shadowy, villainous figure of the lone biker seems to be born directly out of High's nightmares, that is, out of his unconscious, clearly inviting Freudian or Jungian interpretation. Similarly, throughout Miller's Crossing, Tom's hat is emphasized as a visual symbol of something, but of what? On such points, the Coens remain stubbornly silent. Although it is possible to enjoy these films simply on the level of entertainment and narrative engagement, they offer a deeper level of ambiguity, metaphor, and symbolism than does the typical Saturday night diversion. That is to say, like Kubrick, the Coens straddle the boundary between classical Hollywood and the art cinema, occasionally stepping boldly over that line, as with Barton Fink, and in Kubrick's case, with 2001, A Space Odyssey. I have a quotation here from popular culture scholar Linnea Chapman King. She's describing her experiences during a public screening of No Country for Old Men in 2007. Quote, "After the final image of Tommy Lee Jones had cut to black, there were audible exclamations from the patrons around me. That's it? What happened? This 12th film by Joel and Ethan Coen evoked the same response that the brothers' films have been eliciting for over 2 decades. Stunned silence, confusion, disappointment, and perhaps even hostility or disgust from viewers accustomed to tidily packaged cinematic narratives. That's the end of the quote. Such levels of ambiguity bring us to the real heart of the matter, which is that these are films of substance. Both Kubrick and the Coens were brought up in secular Jewish intellectual circles, a tradition steeped in literary, aesthetic, and more broadly philosophical concerns that inevitably find their way into the films, as we certainly will see when we come to A Serious Man a bit later. One of the most illuminating treatises on the films of Stanley Kubrick, James Narramore's On Kubrick from 2007, argues that the director's body of work consistently employs the aesthetic of the grotesque, that is, the sharp contrast of competing emotional experiences for the viewer, often the fearsome juxtaposed with the ludicrous. We find perhaps the most iconic example of this tendency in the scene from A Clockwork Orange, where Alex and his droogs attack the writer and his wife in their home. In costumes that might be read as comical or playful, were it not for the obscenely protruding phallic noses on the clown-like masks, the gang members brutalize their victims while laughing amongst themselves, as Alex offers up an impromptu song and dance performance of Singin' in the Rain. The results are disturbing, to say the least, not only because of the narrative content of the scene, that is the attack itself, but primarily because of Kubrick's aesthetic approach to the material, the aesthetic of the grotesque. A similar aesthetic of the grotesque pervades the films of Joel and Ethan Coen, which consistently blend the darkest of human impulses with the broadest of comedic treatments. Their funniest films, including Raising Arizona, Burn After Reading, The Big Lebowski, and The Hudsucker Proxy, delve into such dire subject matter as kidnapping, blackmail, suicide, and murder. And even their grimmest visions, such as No Country for Old Men, contain moments of humor that make them all the more unsettling. Think of the scene at the little country store in No Country for Old Men. There's a kind of dark humor going on there. True Grit provides a pointed example of this aesthetic in the Coen brothers film. Fairly early in their quest to find Cheney, Rooster Cogburn and Maddie come upon a cabin with 2 pre-adolescent Native American children sitting on the edge of the front porch, tormenting a donkey. As he steps onto the porch, Rooster literally throws one of the children off into the yard. And when he emerges from the cabin moments later, he kicks the other one off the porch. The slapstick nature of the staging, together with the repetition of the gag when Rooster comes out of the cabin, seems calculated to induce laughter, and yet simultaneously guilt in the audience, as if relying upon some feeling of shame in the viewer having laughed at Rooster's blatant racism. The film follows up with Rooster and Maddie discovering a dead body hanging from a tree as they ride through Indian country. This stark image immediately calls to mind America's ugly history of lynchings, pointing up the disgusting logical end of the racism that was played for laughs in the previous scene. A bit later, Rooster and Maddie encounter the same dead body, now in the possession of a traveling medicine man and dentist, himself a rather grotesque figure blending threat and comedy. He is large and foreboding, dressed in a bearskin complete with head. He offers to sell them the body, saying, "I have taken his teeth. I will entertain an offer for the rest of him." Perhaps the most perfect balance of these competing tendencies, the grim and the humorous, occurs in the Coens' dark comedy about kidnapping and murder, Fargo. Consider, for example, the uncomfortably comical interactions between Jerry, William H. Macy, Carl, Steve Buscemi, and Geyer, Peter Stormare, as they make arrangements for the kidnapping of Jerry's wife, Jean, Kristen Rudrud. The abduction scene itself mixes the horrific and the laughably absurd, as Jean, distracted by an inane local morning talk show, watches helplessly as Carl breaks into her home. The scene eventually veers full on into slapstick comedy, with Jean running wildly through the house, wrapped in and blinded by a shower curtain, finally tumbling down the stairs in a stunt gag worthy of Buster Keaton or Jackie Chan. Such twisted humor is repeated later when Carl and Geyer arrive at their hideout with the blindfolded Jean. Her pathetic attempts to run away, stumbling repeatedly, nearly running into a tree, elicit howls of laughter from Carl, and perhaps from the audience as well, but in the latter case, accompanied by cringes of guilt and discomfort. Such a balancing act between polar opposites is the stuff of mythology, and critics have noted the mythological, at times even epic, dimensions of the Coen brothers' films. At the same time, their work is often characterized by a postmodernist, self-aware sense of irony that undercuts a mythologized view of American life, even as it enacts that very mythos. Such is the dynamic of Fargo. These contradictions dovetail nicely with the ambiguity and outlook offered in Kubrick's and the Coens' approaches to philosophy in their films. Philosophy is at the center of Kubrick's and the Coens' work. However, in neither case do the films present us with a particular philosophical outlook. Rather, Kubrick invites his viewers to ponder large philosophical questions without providing us with clear answers. And the Coens present us with characters facing philosophical crises of various stripes, seemingly unaware of their own inconstant worldviews, also without resolving these dilemmas. While Kubrick was disinclined to offer clear philosophical observations in his mature work, he does consistently raise philosophical questions for his viewers. Although we might be tempted to misread A Clockwork Orange in terms of its overt message of morality, I would argue that the film, more so than the 1961 source novel by Anthony Burgess, offers a far more complex rumination on the nature of morality in relation to power structures. Ultimately, the film seems far more interested in the problem of fascism than in simple questions of good and evil, offering a perplexing lack of resolution in which we are left to ponder what Alex's final cure really implies. Again, an ambiguity not present in Burgess's novel with its famed chapter 21, in which Alex grows up. Kubrick would revisit similar questions of the problematic relationships between humanity and structures of class and power in all of his subsequent films. Barry Lyndon is the tragic tale of a naive interloper who underestimates the ruthlessness of the upper classes to which he recklessly aspires. Similarly, Jack Torrance in The Shining is willing to sacrifice everything, including the lives of his family, to the upper class world, albeit a phantom one, that the Overlook Hotel represents. In Full Metal Jacket, Private Joker is able to hang on to something of his humanity by not surrendering entirely to the killer instinct that the military has systematically tried to unleash in the film's other major characters. And in Eyes Wide Shut, Bill Harford barely escapes the most dire consequences for himself and his family as he, like Redmond Barry, fails to see until it is almost too late the brutality that lies just beneath the rich, tempting veneer of the power elites. In one of the most profoundly philosophical films ever made, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke do not provide any answers to the very large questions they posit, indeed, the biggest questions there are about the nature of the universe and humanity's place in it. While the Coen brothers have yet to produce anything quite so revolutionary as 2001, I would argue that they do achieve in most of their work a level of high modernism on par with Kubrick. This claim flies in the face of much of the criticism that derides the Coens as mere practitioners of empty postmodernist pastiche. The scenes that I described from True Grit, for example, put the spectator in a double mode of viewing, characteristic of modernist works, in which we are aware of the film's narrative strategies and how they manipulate our expectations and our responses, forcing us to backtrack and reevaluate those prior emotional reactions. At times, the Coen brothers take the cinema itself as their subject, as in Barton Fink, which is all about the inner processes of creative writing, and Hail Caesar, which seems really to be about the Coens, erstwhile indie outsiders, coming to grips with and even embracing the traditions of classical Hollywood. Also, in a similar vein to Kubrick, the Coen brothers' films consistently explore philosophical and moral questions, as well as psychological symbolism, while rarely offering any but the vaguest of answers. In No Country for Old Men, Anton Chigurh, Javier Bardem, one of the most chilling villains ever to grace the screen, seems bemused by the lack of philosophical integrity in all of his victims. Just as he is about to kill the bounty hunter Carson Wells, played by Woody Harrelson, Chigurh chides him for having no defensible moral code, saying, "If the rule you followed led you to this, of what use was the rule?" On the other hand, Chigurh himself seems to adhere to the fatalistic moral system of fortune's spinning wheel, taking setbacks in stride and showing mercy only when dictated by the flip of a coin. Sorry, I didn't mean to go to the next slide here. Curiously, Chigurh is another dark figure in the Coen universe who may or may not be real. Is he a ghost? Is he a manifestation of the Jungian shadow? Or is he death incarnate? As the Coens close their darkest narrative, closely following their literary source from Cormac McCarthy, they leave us with no answers to these and other questions, only a dream narrated by Sheriff Bell, in which he encounters his long-dead father out on the trail. The father rides on ahead to some unnamed destination, the land of the dead perhaps, and Bell concludes, "I knew that when I got there, he'd be there. And then I woke up." Again, a perplexing ending worthy of the best Stanley Kubrick films. Even The Big Lebowski, which on its surface might appear to justify the label postmodern pastiche, so often applied to the Coens, has a consistent preoccupation with philosophy by way of its varied cast of characters, each of which is an embodiment of a different philosophical outlook. Perhaps the most overtly philosophical of the Coens films is A Serious Man from 2009, in which the protagonist, Larry Gopnik, Michael Stuhlbarg, feels abandoned by God and searches in vain for answers to age-old questions, which predictably are not forthcoming. Repeatedly turned away by the elder Rabbi Marshak at his synagogue, Larry must make do with the banal homilies offered by the much younger junior rabbi, Rabbi Scott, who encourages him to see the beauty in life's struggles, and comically, even in the parking lot adjoining the synagogue, saying, "Just look at that parking lot." Meanwhile, Larry's career and family seem to be unraveling all around him, exacerbating his inability to understand God's plan for him. Even the middle-aged senior rabbi, Rabbi Nachner, merely postpones the question with an engaging but ultimately unresolved story of a dentist who found curious messages from God hidden in a patient's teeth. K.L. Evans, a specialist in English and philosophy at Yeshiva University, argues that the film may be seen as a retelling of the book of Job, whose ultimate lesson is that God does not owe man any answers for anything. Beyond that rather bleak outlook, though, the Coens offer a couple of alternative, not entirely tongue-in-cheek observations on philosophy. The first comes from the epigraph that opens the film, in which the Coens quote the medieval French rabbi Rashi. Receive with simplicity everything that happens to you. The other comes from Jefferson Airplane and lyrics repeated at various points throughout the film. When the truth is found to be lies and all the hope within you dies, don't you want somebody to love? You'd better find somebody to love. Ironically, while Rabbi Marshak is always too busy for Larry, he does confer with Larry's son Danny after his bar mitzvah, repeating some of the lyrics above and urging Danny to be a good boy. Such is the extent of the wisdom that the rabbi has to offer, wisdom that Larry no doubt would reject were it offered to him. We could go on film by film demonstrating that the Coen brothers' supposedly empty films are quite the contrary, philosophically and psychologically complex works. And this should hardly come as a surprise. After all, it is well known that Ethan Coen majored in philosophy at Princeton. And while the Coens, and Stanley Kubrick for that matter, have generally avoided or even spurned questions regarding philosophy or any other deep meanings in their films, for the careful analytical viewer, those elements are unmistakably present throughout both bodies of work. As commercially successful filmmakers who nonetheless have managed to create cinematic works of art across various genres with consistent aesthetic and philosophical leanings, Joel and Ethan Coen stand today as perhaps the clearest heirs to Stanley Kubrick's cinematic legacy. And I look forward to having a discussion with all of you. You can raise your hand electronically. There's a little blue raising hand. Rather than physically raising your hand, if you would use the, under the participants tab, there's a thing where you can raise your hand, and this will allow us to keep track of who raised their hand first. I see Jerry's iPad is the first. Do you have a question or comment? You will have to unmute yourself because we won't be able to hear you otherwise.
Jerry.
Okay, Jerry, I think we can hear you now.
I'll tell you what Costco said there.
Jerry, did you have a comment?
No.
Okay, sorry, your hand was raised. Okay, so Jonathan Brown, which I take to be Aaron Brown. Aaron, I think we're having trouble with your audio, Aaron. Okay, sorry, Aaron. I think we're having trouble with your. I think I saw Frank next.
Yes, I wish we had that last slide up because I was focusing on it. It was up there a while, and in line with your premise about the ambiguity found in both Kubrick and the Coen brothers, which I heartily agree with. On the blackboard, in addition to a bunch of equations, you'll notice on the upper left the word uncertainty. And I know that many scholars use the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle to applying it to liberal arts and so on, which maybe is a mistake. It's really it's a physics concept. But nonetheless, many people do, and the idea of ambiguity and uncertainty seems to be presented, albeit in amidst a bunch of equations and so forth. So I think that's a telling little detail.
Absolutely, and I assume you've seen the film, and all of this scribbling on the blackboard is his attempt to mathematically prove the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. In other words, he's attempting to prove with this massive, this is really only a small portion of the blackboard here, this massive blackboard full of equations, and it's all devoted to proving that we can never really know anything. And it's really hilarious. And you know, Larry, he's trying to teach his students about uncertainty, and yet in his own life, he can't handle uncertainty, right? So he doesn't even live up to his own, and he uses the Schrodinger's cat story as well. And he admits to one of his students, look, even I don't understand the cat, right? So it's really a very, very dryly funny part of the film, I think. Paula, I think you were next.
Yeah, I have a question, Rodney. Do you, you know, a lot of people like to talk about Kubrick and early, middle, late, whatever. I mean, he didn't, compared to even the Coen brothers, he didn't do as many films, right?
Right.
Do you see the Coens' body of work falling into certain categories, or are they just so different that that you can't say like that? It breaks down into those kinds of early, middle, late, or I mean, they're still creating, but.
Yeah, that will be maybe a problem we can address as they get toward the, you know, once their career is over. I mean, I think you can definitely see Blood Simple and Raising Arizona as being what we might call early works, but then pretty quickly they get into a very mature stage of filmmaking. But Miller's Crossing is a wonderfully wrought, really great gangster picture, and I think in terms of production values and anything else, I think it would stand up against anything else made in the early 1990s. And so pretty quickly they're beyond that early period. As was Kubrick also. I mean, by the mid to late 50s, Kubrick was definitely a professional filmmaker, world-class filmmaker by the time he did Paths of Glory. Now with Kubrick, there's a pretty clear break, I think, from 2001 onwards, where he's doing something else, right? So even a very complex, brilliant film like Dr. Strangelove still kind of works as a movie, right? You can just go and watch Dr. Strangelove and enjoy it just as an entertaining, very funny, dark comedy. 2001 is something else altogether. Right. And I think pretty much everything Kubrick did from that point on, it has to be seen as, every one of those films is just a strange, wonderful, mysterious work of modern art. Not that the earlier films aren't, but that you can't really approach A Clockwork Orange or Barry Lyndon or really any of these movies as simply a Friday night movie that you would go. There's clearly, so I think that's why we kind of divide Kubrick's career kind of in half in a way.
Right.
That's a good question about the Coens. I mean, there's so much all over the place, and they'll go from something very dark and very serious to something seemingly light and insubstantial, but I think even their light and insubstantial films are actually very substantial. So,
what is your least favorite Coen film? I'm just curious.
Probably their remake of The Lady Killers, and it's not really their film. They took that film over from Barry Sonnenfeld, who had to go off and do something else, and it's okay. It's okay. I mean, I'm not going to criticize. What have I done after all? But it's the least. But even that film has a lot of nice things in it. What about you? Do you have a least favorite?
No, actually, that would be my that would be my choice too. And when I think about how much I enjoyed True Grit, and I will tell you, I watched the original as a youngster and loved that film because I read the book. And when I heard they were doing a remake, I was like, oh, I mean, they always do interesting stuff, but at the same time, I was like, ugh. And then I really enjoyed it. So I think everything you pointed out about it exactly is what made it so much better. Really, even than the original, which was more just for entertainment. And so,
and I think with True Grit, they avoided trying to do too much of a remake of the 1970 John Wayne movie, and they went back to the source novel and did their own adaptation of the novel, which I do find is much more nuanced, much more sophisticated than the John Wayne film.
One little quick thing. I was doing my class this semester and I showed Lolita for Suburban Gothic. And I never knew this, and I can't tell you how many times I've watched that and The Shining. And you probably know this, but in The Shining, and when in the iconic opening overhead shot when they're driving to the overlook, they pass a car that stopped on the road, and it's the same car as in Lolita.
Oh, it's so small in the frame.
I know.
didn't
I
notice it.
never noticed it until I was doing a little research. So that was another one of those allusion, and that's Kubrick alluding to himself, his early work, which I thought was interesting.
Right, he does that a lot. So do the Coen brothers.
Right.
Aaron, we're going to try you again. Aaron Brown, did you still had your hand up? Yes.
Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that.
Great. Again, thanks for this session, Rodney. What I offer is the fact that perhaps people might agree that the pinnacle of each, the Coen brothers and Kubrick, would be 2001 for various of the points that you've made. Certainly the frustration level on the part of the audience at the end of each, trying to figure out what the message was. And you mentioned violent reactions to it. I was at the Malvern the first time I saw it in Long Island. And a guy stepped up from the audience and said, "This is bullshit," out loud like a banshee. And my students react the same way when I screen it. But aside from the beginnings and endings that are so alike in 2001 and No Country, there's this wonderful scene in No Country that also is Kubrick-like. And that's on the bridge to Juarez, where Llewellyn meets up with those three young men. And I have my class always asking, the three represent the three leads in the film, which ones represent which. And everybody agrees that the young man on the right who says, "Were you in an accident? Were you in a car accident?" And then later says, "Give him the beer, Brian," is the humanistic Ed Tom. And the beauty of that sequence is, Kubrick-like, is in wondering which of the other two represent Anton and represent Llewellyn. And it's always a tough argument because they each are so similar, as the entire No Country suggests, that Llewellyn is almost as evil as Anton by virtue of his not caring about the consequences of his actions, including the death of his wife. And it provides a wonderful Kubrick-like moment of a duality within the characters in their films, where they're not necessarily strictly evil, strictly good, but a combination thereof. And it's then echoed in the final scene with the car accident and the two young boys who represent the two living members. There it's much more cut and dried. Obviously, the guy who takes his shirt off is the Ed Tom Bell character. And of course, the one with, "Look at the fucking bone," is Anton. Anyhow, the connections are just marvelous.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. I had not thought of that. Thank you for that. I've just always thought of the Josh Brolin character as being sort of just a dumb film noir type. He's just so stupid that he doesn't realize, he can't foresee the consequences of his actions. Right. The very fact that he goes back out to the scene of the killings is like, what are you doing? Like, how stupid can you be, right? But he shows how stupid he can be. Let's see. Brett is next, I believe.
It took me a while to figure out how to raise my hand. So.
Yes, right.
But just you mentioned Josh Brolin in No Country for Old Men. I didn't think he was stupid. It was risky. He was feeling bad for the guy who had no water, and he went back out there knowing what he was doing. And I feel like he knows he's living his life. He's like immortal, and he knows he could die, but he's living it with courage anyway, which is kind of what we have to do. I kind of see him as us, not really as an idiot. But I rose my hand about A Serious Man. When they did the whole chalkboard with all the equations, I thought that was pretty glorious. I love that.
Yeah.
But then when he says, and this proves that you can't know anything about anything, that's really a false step for me, because that's what someone might say who doesn't understand any of the physics of it. And what the uncertainty principle really tells you is you really can predict things and you can know things, but you have to ask the right question. You only get uncertainty when you try to measure the wrong thing and ask the wrong question, which can't be answered. But if you frame your questions correctly and ask the right question, you can get very precise and exact answers. So it's more about, think about what you're asking and you'll get the right answer. If you ask the wrong question, you won't get an answer.
Aha.
I don't know if they knew that or not, but
Oh, I'm sure they did. I'm not sure they expected everybody in the audience to get that.
it just seemed like a cheap throwaway gag, like, oh, you can't know anything.
Well, but maybe it also shows the fact that he doesn't even understand what he's trying to teach his students, right? Which I think kind of fits in with some of the other patterns. At some point, he even admits that he doesn't understand it, right? Because he's using the Schrodinger's cat story.
Yeah.
He's trying to mix physics and philosophy and all sorts of things, and he doesn't really understand what he's talking about. And the funny thing about, I think Schrodinger's cat often gets misused as well, because from my understanding, Schrodinger used this example as a way to disprove what he thought was the uncertainty principle, or to disprove, but people have used it assuming that he was serious about the cat and the fact that the cat is simultaneously dead and alive. It's like, no, that's kind of not the point of that story either.
But that's the thing, the cat's real. And they actually make Schrodinger cat states in the lab now. So he used it to mock the idea, but it turns out he was wrong. The idea actually works. And the Schrodinger cat, so that's actually something he was more right about than Schrodinger even realized.
Huh.
And I like that discussion in the movie. I thought it was very accurate from sort of a way a physicist would think about it. But the line about you can't know anything about anything, I feel that's a false move by the filmmakers. They didn't do their research on that. And that was sort of a joke. And I think they missed on that one.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, but to me, the joke is that he's making this claim. He's saying you can't know anything about anything, and yet he, in his own life, is demanding answers from God, right? He's going to the rabbi, tell me what God expects from me. It's like, okay, you know, it's sort of a very unreasonable question for him to ask. Let's see. Thank you for that. Okay. Let's see. John, I see you physically raising your hand, so we'll come to you.
So I've been flagging. Not to get into physics, but just to play with the metaphor. So you know better than I. To what degree do you feel these filmmakers are entangled, and what? How do you interpret that?
Well, I think the Coens paid tribute to a lot of writers and filmmakers throughout their work, but I think Kubrick is one of their favorites, and they've said this in interviews when they've been asked about their favorite filmmakers. They've named people like Coppola and Kubrick, and so I mean
So it's conscious. It's conscious. It's deliberate for the most part, you would say.
Well,
and no, that's a tricky one.
Good luck ever getting a filmmaker to admit that anything is deliberate or conscious, but how could it not be conscious? I mean, these things, everything in a film is put there by the filmmakers. There is no world that exists that they're simply capturing on film. Every element that you see in a film is fabricated by the filmmakers, and so I think these are pretty clear. Maybe I didn't do as good a job as I should have in selecting examples, but they seem pretty deliberate to me.
No, I just didn't know how extensive the case is. I know you were limited for time, so I didn't know how far you would go with this.
Yeah, and in the longer version of the paper, there are some other examples, but they're not only referring to Kubrick. So I'm not saying it's all about Kubrick and their work.
Yeah,
I do find these similarities. Also, I kind of skipped over the similarities in their careers, and so to some extent we can say, so what, but I do think it's interesting to trace the influence of one artist in another artist's work, but then they're not simply recreating Kubrick's work. They're taking
Sure.
ideas from Kubrick and from a lot of other places and turning those into their own work. Some of the other references, this is not a reference to Kubrick, but in Hail Caesar, there's a scene that just immediately calls to mind The Big Sleep. It's not directly quoting The Big Sleep, but it's right out of The Big Sleep. The scene where Bogart comes into this house and finds the camera and everything. It's pretty directly quoted, but they're doing something else with it. So they're not simply in a kind of postmodern pastiche style saying, look, The Big Sleep. Kind of in the way that, something like Shrek is very postmodern in its references. Oh, let's refer to this fairy tale and that fairy tale and the other fairy tale, and there's never really anything interesting going on. But with them, there's a reference, and then they turn that reference to their own purposes.
Sure.
And that's something I find interesting.
Makes me think of Goethe. It was beg, steal, and borrow. Just use it well.
I mean, everybody,
better at that.
Everybody borrows, right?
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Let's see, I haven't heard from Michael yet. So Michael Biondi.
Hello, how are you?
Great, how are you? Thanks for joining
us.
us.
Good. I wanted to comment on, I actually wanted to ask a little further about what you said regarding A Serious Man, and I also would like to make reference to what Brett was saying about A Serious Man. I think we need to consider the religious implications of, I don't remember the main character's name. I can remember the actor was Michael Stuhlbarg. When he was speaking with his student who says, I understand about the cat, but I don't understand the math. And he's saying, well, the math is everything. The cat's just a story. And I think that that's actually kind of commenting on the religious implications of the stories are there to illustrate the lessons. That, the morals are within the Bible, the Torah, whatever we're talking about, but it's the stories that illustrate them. And then to bring it to what you were saying about the parking lot, I was just going to ask you to revisit your interpretation of the young rabbi, what he had to say about looking at the parking lot.
Well, I was probably fairly glib in this presentation because it's so, we had such limited time, but in a way he is making a very astute observation, right? That we can find God everywhere. You can find God that God is everywhere. You can find the beauty of the world anywhere you look for it. So for example, in this coffee cup, I could find great beauty if I would simply take the time to stop and really look at it and really see it. And so that was the point that this sort of junior rabbi is making about the parking lot. But for Larry at that moment, though, this is not the lesson that he's looking for. And so this maybe ties back to Brett's comment. He's not asking the right questions.
Right.
His question is, why is God punishing me with all these tragedies in my life? What have I done to deserve this? And that's the wrong question. And so the junior rabbi actually does offer a valuable lesson, like look at the beauty in the parking lot. Mm-hmm. But Larry is just not in a place where he can receive that wisdom.
The way I interpreted it was that the junior rabbi is telling him, if when you're looking for God, you could look at the parking lot. And at the end of the movie, we look across the parking lot and see the twister coming. Yes. And I had to wonder, is that the Coen's commentary is, if you're looking for God, understand that God exists in both love and disaster and such as that in looking for it, you're going to see all aspects of it. And, if we want to tie it back with No Country for Old Men, Cormac McCarthy, the passage in Blood Meridian that, we are here to basically enact war, that nature is chaos. And we see, the chaos of nature across the parking lot that Larry's been told to look at, that here you go, here's your answer. So I don't want to discount what Brett was saying, but I don't think they dropped the ball in that section with the chalkboard. I think it's actually saying that we can't put meaning to anything. As hard as we try, it's beyond our understanding. And we can create the stories, but it's the best we can do is make those stories. That the meaning isn't really for us to understand.
Right, and if I can bring this to one of my heroes, Joseph Campbell, I'm going to misquote him, I'm sure, but he was talking about how, you know, the greatest things can't be known, right? We can't really know the nature of the universe. We can't know God really. But those are the best things. The next best things are our concepts about them, the thoughts that we have to try to understand that. And then the third best are the things we talk about when we try to actually put things into words. We're so far removed from the thing that those words are referring to that we've really lost any sense of understanding of that. Yeah, and all of these comments, I think, just further illustrate the point that, I mean, these are very substantial films. It's surprising to me how many critics have just written off the Coen brothers as being vacuous and empty, and I think it's far from the truth, right? So they're really grappling with some of the big issues, right? That can only be grappled with symbolically or through stories. Lloyd, I think you're next.
Yes, and thank you very much. I just have a quick comment on the equation board in the serious matter. I noticed Hebrew lettering, and in keeping with the religious aspect of the movie, and since I don't know Hebrew very much at all, I wonder if there was anything momentous about those letters or any kind of meaning in them, unless they were just parts of the equations. Or, I mean, everything is part of the equation, if you know what I mean. But that was just what I wanted to note.
That I don't know, to be honest. I don't know Hebrew at all. But I would suggest maybe a place to look is another chapter in that book that I mentioned, the book called After Kubrick. A brilliant scholar named Nathan Abrams has a chapter in there on the Coen, on Kubrick's status as a secular Jewish artist and how that has impacted other filmmakers, including the Coen brothers. And so he may or may not touch on that particular detail in that chapter. I'm not really sure.
Just about the board, there are a lot of random things. It's like, maybe you'd call it a pastiche. It's just a bunch of things thrown together that aren't really connected. But Aleph, like, it's the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet. And I'm not a mathematician, but it turns out we use Aleph to represent different infinities, different levels of infinity. Like, there's a infinite number of integers, and there's an infinite number of real numbers, and there's an infinite number of complex, and there are different Alephs, Aleph naught, Aleph 1, Aleph 2. So maybe they're going for different levels of infinity on the board, or maybe they're just putting up the Hebrew letter. You know? Maybe.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, one thing is for sure, you will never get the Coen brothers to explain what they were doing with that. They would just refuse to do that. But we see the board so briefly that I think, I mean, clearly some thought was put into it, but it's really there for the gag of this blackboard absolutely full of equations that he claims all leads to the conclusion that we can never really know anything, right? So I mean, to me, it's a great gag, right? All this elaborate mathematical proof that you can't really know anything, right? So, but I'm not sure we're meant to pick up on all those details, but I'm sure they also understood that people would do freeze frames and try to analyze what they're doing at the same time. Frank, you've had your hand up for a while, yes. Oh, you're muted, Frank. Frank, you're muted, so you need to unmute. You're muted. Let me unmute you. Okay.
Blackboard, but I wanted to clarify what I believe the Heisenberg uncertainty principle states, because I was, as I said, I took that capstone course in physical chemistry, the hardest course I ever took. And as I understand it, it is that you cannot determine the position and the velocity of a particle because the very act of measuring the speed and velocity changes the result. Now that has some implications to philosophy and life and other things about our perception and how they distort things, but it doesn't mean, you know, you can't know anything. But the other thing I wanted to, if I might, main thing I wanted to discuss was you made a very convincing case, to me at least, that the Coen brothers were certainly influenced by Stanley Kubrick. But I wonder if you would speculate on influences on Kubrick. And my thought has always been that Orson Welles was a major influence on Kubrick, in particular in terms of the thematic ambiguity that you pointed out, the emphasis on cinematic style that they both display, and it was also brought out the duality of characters. In fact, in Citizen Kane, the character says, "You don't realize you're talking to two people." So I think there are those three big traits that they share. I wondered if you'd speculate on that, Rodney.
Well, that's a great question, Frank. I don't think there's any doubt that Kubrick admired Orson Welles as a filmmaker. And there's a wonderful book by Robert Kolker, whom you may know.
Oh, yes, I know him very well.
Where he talks about Kubrick and Welles and I think Hitchcock all
Yes.
in the same book. And so certainly those connections have been made. Other filmmakers that I know Kubrick admired include Max Ophuls. I mean, Kubrick gets his penchant for long takes and moving cameras from Ophuls, and Kubrick even admired Charlie Chaplin. And I've never quite picked out the clear influence of Chaplin on Kubrick. He was also influenced by the Russian formalists. He said that he never could make much sense out of Eisenstein's writings, but he found Kudovkin's writings to be quite useful. And so, yeah, Kubrick was influenced by other filmmakers. He was even influenced by bad filmmakers. You know, growing up as a teenager in the Bronx, he was going to the movies, and he said, at some point, he said, you know, I could do better than most of these movies that I'm seeing. So, yeah, he also had a great deal of admiration for the Polish director Krzysztof Kieslowski, and I'm sure there are others that I'm just not thinking of at the moment. But whether he was directly impacted by them, I don't think you find really any clear references to other filmmakers in his work, but clearly there were others that he admired. Okay, well, gosh, thank you all for a very spirited discussion. Thank you for joining us on this gray afternoon. I really appreciate it. And thank you again, Carol, for setting this up. The Cultural Center is really doing such very important work for us, and we appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.
Rodney.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Hope to see you all.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Carol, do we need to talk about anything?
No, I think we just have to talk about how we're going to get the videos up. Somebody requested one already.
Okay.
So whenever you have time.
I guess I'll do the same thing as I did with the other one, which I think, did that work out with Francis?
I didn't hear anything. I'll follow up with him.
Okay, because I sent it to him and then I didn't hear back from him either. So if I need to resend it, I can. Okay.
I'll follow up and let you know.
If that worked, I'll just do the same thing.
Okay, perfect. Great.
All right. Thanks
a
lot.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.